Okay, so now we're at the point where we're ready to start actually cutting the fingers into our finger board. So the question is, do we go ahead and cut this angle first and then cut all our fingers, or do we cut the fingers and then cut it afterwards? And my logic is you better go ahead and cut it now, because when we have just the little fingers, the rotation of the saw blade is probably going to want to knock them off. So definitely go ahead and cut this piece first. So the next step is, well, how long do we want the fingers? And it's kind of a judgment call. It's up to you. But what I want to do is I want to stay at least an inch away from our slots here. I don't want to take a chance of the fingers basically wanting to split and continue running down and meet these slots here. So I'm going to stay a good inch, inch and a quarter. My blade here on my bevel gauge is 1 inch, so just eyeballing it, coming up to, say a 1/4 inch there. Make a line, and that's going to give me that much material to essentially make my fingers out of, staying safely away from our slots here. Okay, so with our angle cut, we are ready to start making our fingers. Now, how thick you make the fingers is really up to you. It depends on how rigid you want this board to be. Do you want it to have a lot of pressure or a lot of spring with a little bit lighter pressure? Just through my experience, I found that about a 3/16 inch finger works the best for me. It kind of is a good, middle of the road size. So what you could do is, hopefully your saw has a built-in ruler, and you simply set it for 3/16. Move it over to 3/8, move it over to 9/16, and then 3/4, 15/16, and so on and so on. Problem is, after many cuts, keep adding those 3/16 together, it can be a little confusing. So to take all the guesswork out of it, I simply made a shim like this right here. The idea being to set your saw for 3/16 the first time, make your cut. When you reach your line, shut the saw off, wait for the blade to stop. Leave the board in place. Open the fence, drop your shim in, bring it back, lock it down. Now you're ready to make another cut. Continue this process all the way down and you'll have perfectly spaced fingers the entire length. So with the fingers now cut, this part of the process is pretty much done. The only other thing I want to do is basically cut off this excess. I don't really need it anymore. One other thing I wanted to point out, when I was cutting those fingers, I had the blade raised as high as I could get it. And that's because the blade, being circular, is always going to undercut on the bottom side, meaning that the cut on the bottom will stick out further than the one on the top. But by raising the blade as high as we can get it, we get the, as close to a vertical cut as we can possibly get here. So with that operation done, we're ready to move on and actually start working on the bar that's going to fit into the miter slot to actually hold this thing in place. Okay, so now turning our attention to the bar that's actually going to fit into the miter gauge and secure this feather board down. What I've done was selected a piece that's about 3/4 of an inch tall, 1 inch wide, and about 16 inches long. Now those dimensions will change later on, but right now we want as much material to work with as possible for safety, and also one other operation that I'm fixing to discuss here. But at this stage, what you want to do is basically center it over the featherboard, and you do want to have the featherboard at the correct angle that it will contact the wood, so that 30-degree angle. Now all I want to do is come from this longest point here about 3/4 of an inch and make a little mark. Do the same thing up here, make a mark. Now what I'm going to do is take my square and actually transfer these lines all the way around, and I'll meet you back here in just a second and show you the next step. Okay, so now that we have a 1/2 inch straight bit in the lathe, what I'm going to do is route about a 30-second groove between this line and this line. So I'm just going to plunge it in, go to the other side, and simply move it apart. Now it'll become clear why I'm doing this in the next step, but what's important right now is to make sure that you route it on the wider end, the 1 inch part, not the 3/4. And again, in the next step, it's going to become clear why we're doing that. Okay, so the next step is to take our board and rip it in half. And what we want to do is we want to have our routed side facing up. Now, it's not terribly important if it's dead center, but you want to make sure that it's pretty close and that you have at least 3/8 on either side. Again, that's why we started with a 1-inch board. So now that we have our piece ripped in half, the idea is we are going to put them facing each other to create this gap here. Well, how does that benefit us? Well, the idea is if we turn it over, what we're going to do is, of course, first glue this together, and then we're going to counterbore 2 holes here and also 2 through holes. What we're going to use is a tapered bolt like this. Okay, that's going to go all the way through with the head, of course, countersunk in there. Okay, when we put our featherboard on top and then add a wing nut, what that's going to do is that's going to draw that bolt up into this wood very tightly. The idea being that it's going to expand into our track here, thus tightening it down and locking our featherboard in place. Now, just like on those fancy TV cooking shows, I actually already have one made up in advance. This one is cherry. Of course, it doesn't really matter what you use, but I just chose cherry because that's what I had laying around. I've already got this one cut to length. I kind of knocked off the edges just to make it a little easier to work with. And I planed it down, and I planed it down just ever so slightly below the track. You don't want it too thin, and you absolutely do not want it to stick up proud past the track. Now you might be wondering, well, why not just maybe drill some holes and then run, say, a small kerf on the the scroll saw or something? Well, the problem is you are creating a weak point, of course, and being that the grain is running in line with that, it's very likely that when you start expanding, that crack is going to want to continue and basically split it in half. With a glue joint, we don't have to worry about that. Okay, so we're ready to drill our holes, but we need to figure out where we need to drill them. Now, obviously, we want the holes to be symmetrical within our bar down here. So what I did was brought the fence up, brought the featherboard up to where it is, touching it so that we know it's in the proper position. And using a ruler, again, I made sure that it was symmetrical on both sides. Now, what we want to do is mark the center of these holes. Now that's a little tricky to do because the pencil can move around on us. So what I'm going to do though is take my ruler and make me a little line right here on edge. Reason I'm doing that, my ruler is an 1/8 inch thick. An 1/8 inch is half of our 1/4 inch hole. So if we simply slide down till we meet that line, then what we can do is go in and mark the just this top edge right here with a line. Do it on both sides, and now we know that our holes are going to be absolutely centered when we take it to the drill. So over at the drill press, what I did was installed a metal cutting bit, and it's important to use one of those because the nose of the bit is tapered, so that's going to match the taper of our bolt that we're going to use. A Forstner bit, of course, is going to give you a flat bottom hole, and most wood bits are a brad point, and the wings of the drill bit are also, they project more, so it's not going to give you that conical shape that we're after. So a metal bit's the way to go. Now what I did was I set up a fence, and that's to give me the exact center here. And the way I did that was simply used the glue joint because we know that's absolutely in the center of it. So just making a few tests, bringing it down until that lined up where I needed it, and that's ready to go. I have the lines here that we laid out on the table saw over there, and those I can pretty much just eyeball. Now, one thing I do want to mention is you really want to use the stop setting that's on your drill press. This style of bit, especially in wood, gets real grabby, so it's real easy for it to lunge down and take out a lot more wood than you want it to do. So with the stop set, we're ready to start drilling some holes.